All right, so let's talk about space. It's one of our elements of art, and it's a really important element for getting a realistic sense to your artwork, to getting a sense of realism. And what we're going to specifically focus on, because there's a lot going on with this element, but we're only going to talk right now about linear perspective. Now, I think linear perspective is a topic that stresses some students out, and they seem to think that it's overwhelming or complicated, or they lose a little bit of confidence when it comes to linear perspective. However, it's very simple, and we're going to walk you through a couple exercises just to make sure you're understanding it and to really build your confidence. So let's start with some things that you already know. Atmospheric perspective. Now that's when you create a realistic illusion of depth with value, because this is all about creating the sense of space, right? Creating the sense that your two-dimensional artwork has a lot of depth, that it goes really far back. So you've done that with atmospheric perspective. Many of you have done a little watercolor study where you have the back value is light, the dark value, the front values are dark, and that change from dark to light creates this little illusion of depth. Now, you might have done it with just one value or one hue, rather, but you've noticed in probably realistic paintings that same principles happen. You're having really dark values in the foreground, the middle ground has medium values, the background has light values. But either way, all that's creating, it's one way to make perspective happen. It's through the atmosphere. However, there's another way to make perspective happen without value. If you want to work with something like a Sharpie, you're not going to get different kinds of value. However, you can still, with that mark making tool, make a very realistic illusion of depth, and that's with linear perspective. And linear perspective is just creating the illusion of depth with lines, not value. So let's look at this little example. Here we have a railroad track. We know in real life these two rails will never touch. They will absolutely never touch. They're parallel and they're infinitely parallel. However, when they're on a two-dimensional plane, what happens is our brain almost imagines that at some point they touch. If you think about the curve of the earth and how our brain sees the world, we are going to make them vanish at one similar point or one same point. And that's how linear perspective creates an illusion for depth for us. We mimic that perception in our artwork. So here we have the artist has these two lines that we know never touch, but because our brains in real life assume that they do, that's what the artist has done here. They go all the way back to the tunnel where they vanish, and they appear to touch. So here even like the value even gets darker as you go back into the artwork, and it's almost lighter up here, but even with that reverse value, you still have this perception that this is going back in space. This is closer to us, and this is further away. And that illusion is really created with just the lines. So let's just talk quickly about the historical context of linear perspective, because it wasn't always understood. If you ever look at medieval art is things is artwork from like the 1300s. They didn't understand linear perspective. They understood value. So this painting has great value. It's very realistic, right? But if you look at the place they're in, the architecture, it starts to feel like a fun house because all the lines go in just any old direction they want to. Let's start looking at them. We have lines on the ceiling, we have lines on the columns, we have a desk that goes who knows where, but this is all pure mayhem. And your brain, the longer you look at this, really can't make sense of the space. It feels very much like a fun house. Now, you saw in the last artwork, all your lines should converge in one point if you're doing one-point perspective. Here, this artist, if these lines continue, they just go any old spot. They do not all intersect. Pure mayhem. So, in the 1400s, during the Renaissance, they started to discover linear perspective and create a formula for how to depict it. So this painting by Leonardo da Vinci, The Last Supper, you've probably seen references to this one. This our brain looks at and says, oh yeah, they're in a room, like no questions, because all these lines make total sense. Every line from the panels, from the ceiling, everything goes back to one point. And what this artist is doing, because he was pretty good, Leonardo da Vinci, he put an important focal point where the lines all converge. So your brain, even though the lines don't extend to the vanishing point, even though they all stop, our brain will continue it. Our brain knows this is where they're going to go. And putting Jesus' face in the center is a nice added touch because it really emphasizes the focus on him. So there's essentially, with linear perspective, there's really two kinds. There's 1-point perspective and 2-point perspective. Right now, we're only going to focus on 1-point perspective. And what that means is that you have a horizon line, and that's this line all the way up here. And then all the lines that recede, all the lines going back in space will all vanish at 1 point. 1-point perspective. 2 points means that all the lines that go back into space, so all these lines at the top and the bottom of the buildings, they will go to one of two sides. They'll either go to the right or the left because there's two vanishing points in this image. So very simple. It's 1 point is where they all vanish, or 2 points. Now they all have to have the horizon line. That's where the sky meets the earth. They also all have to have a vanishing point. That's where all the lines appear to vanish. Let's look at a couple of just painting examples. This one is 1-point perspective because that's the one we're going to focus on. You can see all the major lines. We have a horizon line that goes across. All the major lines that go back stop at that red dot, which is the vanishing point. But this artwork here is interesting because it's almost a little bit boring. When the artist has the vanishing point in the center, and when the horizon line is almost in the center, it's just a little dull. It's still a good painting. It's just not that exciting to look at. Now look at this one instead. This one, still, that's the bell, still 1-point perspective. All the lines that recede go to that 1 point, and there is a horizon line. But if you take the horizon line and just raise it up a little bit, or if you take the vanishing point and push it to one side, like the left, see how it's just a much more dynamic and interesting composition? So this artist that was doing the same thing that Leonardo da Vinci did, he's putting an interesting focal point at the vanishing point here, which is a nice little trick some artists do. So when you take the horizon line and either raise it up or take the vanishing point and move it to the left or right, or maybe take the horizon line and move it all the way down, that'll just create a slightly more interesting composition. Just keep that in mind as you work. Now what you're going to do to really understand this concept is there's 2 exercises you're going to do, and there's going to be a little demo with these, but these exercises should be done in your sketchbook with a ruler or a straight edge, a pencil or a pen. Just make sure you're doing it on paper. You're going to see an example done on a tablet, but your work should be done on paper in your sketchbook. All right, let's walk through exercise number 1. So what you want to do on your piece of paper with your pencil or pen and your ruler or straight edge is you want to start out by drawing your horizon line. So now that you have your horizon line, go ahead and draw your vanishing point. Remember, that has to be on the horizon line. And once you have your vanishing point, somewhere up high, draw a square. Then on the horizon line, draw a square. And somewhere below the horizon line, also draw a square. And then use your pencil or ruler or straight edge, start drawing connecting lines from these squares to the vanishing point. Now go ahead and draw lines connecting your square to the vanishing point. And notice how for the square that's up high, it's like you're looking up at it. So you can see the bottom of the square, not the top, just the bottom. And then for that square that's over on the horizon line, since it's on the horizon line, it's eye level with you, you really can't see a top or bottom. You can only see the side. And lastly, that square that's on the bottom, it's like you're looking down at that square. You're going to see a side, and you'll see a top to that square. So now to finish up this exercise, you're just going to very carefully draw squares all around your picture plane, all over your page, and connect them back to that vanishing point. And that's all you're going to do for exercise 1. Now once that's done for exercise 2, what you want to do is a similar thing. You're going to start with your horizon line and your vanishing point. Remember that vanishing point still has to be on the horizon line. But this time, instead of doing squares, I want you to try more complicated shapes. So think of shapes that you find more complicated. You can start with triangles. And then try some more complicated shapes. Try inventing some shapes and see if you can figure out how to connect them back to the vanishing point. And you can just obviously make up shapes, but if that gets a little bit of a roadblock for you, maybe go with block letters. Those can be a good reference too to practice. Then after you've done a few of these unique shapes, what you can also try and do is practice cutting them off so that they become an actual perspective block as opposed to having all those connector lines. So look for all these lines that I'm noting with the double parallels. So these lines with double parallels, they don't recede back into space. What you want to do is actually draw a line that is parallel to them. And if you keep drawing parallel lines here, you'll eventually get a little block shape that feels very three-dimensional and fairly realistic. And then you can erase those connecting lines that go back to the vanishing point if you want to as well. So I would say end by practicing to make some of the shapes released from their connecting line, so they're just freestanding block shapes. And if you have any questions, please note what they are. We can talk about them when you're next in class, and hopefully you can have some fun with this.